Welcome to the Heart and Soul Wellness Podcast, where we inspire women by teaching applicable skills and tools and assisting them with connecting with one another, healing, and aspiring to their highest selves so they can reach their full potential. Thank you so much for joining us. As many of you know, this month is Sexual Assault Awareness Month. And today we're going to be talking about survivors of trauma and how they can heal from very painful, emotionally devastating experiences, as well as physically and sexually. Today we're talking about healing from incest, rape, marital rape, sexual assault, and incest. I hope this podcast is a place of healing and strength for individuals who are healing from sexual assault. We will also be taking some time to talk about domestic violence because, as we know, many individuals are sexually assaulted by their partner. Cultural misconceptions about domestic violence and sexual assault are a really important conversation for us to have so that more victims can find empowerment and reject the shaming messages that are often internalized. It's an honor to have Adrienne Gillespie with us today, Adrienne Gillespie Andrews. I'm going to tell you a little bit about her. She's incredible. It was an honor to be able to work with her while I was at Weber State, and I really admire the work that she does. So let me tell you a little bit about her. Adrienne Andrews earned a Bachelor's of Arts degree in Political Science with a minors in Ethics, Studies, and Spanish, and another Bachelor of Arts in Women's Studies, both from the University of Utah. She completed a master's degree in Women's Studies at Minnesota State University and another master's degree in Political Science at Rutgers University. She then earned a postgraduate degree in Conflict Resolution and Mediation from the University of Utah and is currently working on a PhD in Education, Culture, and Society at the University of Utah. Adrienne has worked in a variety of government, higher education, and nonprofit capacities, including director of the Center of Youth Policy and Programs for the state of New Jersey, staff associate in the New Jersey Department of State, political science instructor at Rutgers, women's studies instructor at MSUM, graduate associate and research associate at the Eagleton Institute of Politics and the Center for American Women in Politics. A native Utahn, Adrienne was raised in Davis County and has a long history of advocacy and social justice and inclusion work with a special capacity for community building. Andrews currently serves as a member of the McKay and Layton Hospital boards, the Boys and Girls Club of Weber Davis Board, and the honorary commander of the Hill Force Space 75th Wing. She most recently served on the Utah Governor's Martin Luther King Jr. and Human Rights Commission. Adrienne, it's an honor to have you with us. It's incredible.
It's a delight to be here with you and your listeners today. Thank you so much for inviting me, Sarah. You just said a lot of very kind things about me. And the only one that I can absolutely validate is that it was a treat to get to work with you at Weber State. Absolutely.
Oh, thank you so much. The honor, of course, was mine, but I appreciate having you here. So we want to talk today about how we can change the conversation about sexual assault and how it impacts individuals who are healing and recovering. I had the honor of going to lunch with Adrienne last week, and we had a really incredible conversation about how it's very common for the victim to be blamed after a sexual assault. The conversation typically goes to, what were you wearing? How are you dressed? What behaviors were you engaging in?
What did you do? What did you do as the person who was victimized to cause that victimization?
Yes. Yeah.
It's horrific that it is 2022 and that is still the way that many questions are presented to survivors of sexual assault or domestic violence. And the first thing we have to do, I'm going to get on my horse, folks, so just be ready to gallop away with me. But we've got to stop blaming victims of these assaults. Nothing you could do, nothing you could say or wear or not wear results in a rapeable offense, results in an offense where someone should be able to beat you or harm you. Nothing that you do.
That's right. That's right.
I like put a fine point on that, because when we start asking those questions, well, what did you say? What did you wear? What didn't you say? What didn't you wear? What didn't you do? Then we make the violent act that has occurred the responsibility of the individual who's experienced it at the hands of someone else. Instead, we need to be looking at the perpetrator and asking, why did the perpetrator do these things? What was the context that the perpetrator thought that any of these things were appropriate and okay, so that we can really start working with the folks who are committing sexual assault, committing domestic violence, interpartment, or I have to think about this word, I always get it wrong, intimate partner violence, all of these other things, instead of focusing on the person who's been victimized in a negative way. So there's that. And so once we stop blaming the victim, the next thing that we can do is we can believe people who've been victimized. Mm-hmm. And that means, go ahead, Sarah.
Oh, well, I wanted to validate what you just said, because I think it's so critical. Listening to someone's story without judgment, without shame, but truly just holding space and listening to what that horrific incident was, as little or as much as they want to, as that individual wants to share.
And in those moments when someone is sharing their experience with you, it's really good for you to be a strong listener. And sometimes we want to validate the person and compare their experience to something we ourselves have experienced. But that is sort of a zero-sum game, especially in these circumstances. And if you have no experience in these areas, even saying things like, I don't have words, but I'm here with you. You know, I'm here to cry with you, to hold your hand, to listen to what you've experienced, to help find resources and supports, or to agree that these things are wrong and it's horrible that they happen ever. And for this individual who's experienced it and is now surviving that experience, that we are there to listen and be responsive. And when we believe someone when they come forward, and we provide them with the resources and the support to move through the circumstances they've just experienced and to define what life will look like for themselves moving forward, that is changing the conversation. Because it's not a conversation about what the perpetrator did to you that will stop you from engaging in the world in the ways in which you want. It is engaging you and meeting an individual where they are at and saying, this has happened. This is horrific. How do you want to move forward? And how can we help you be successful in that way while recognizing that you've experienced this brutal trauma, right? And just the listening to someone and being willing to directly acknowledge that what happened was not their fault also increases our chances that somebody will report the incident or incidents.
Yes.
When we victim blame or we're holding someone accountable for what happened to them, that allows us to sort of be like, well, I would never make those choices. This would never happen to me because I would never be connected to people who would have these behaviors or harm someone. And so it sort of creates this, you've done something wrong, I would never do that, which doesn't help anyone, because the reality is domestic violence and sexual assault are more likely to happen with people that we know, people that we're in relationships with, that we care about. And so when you look around and you see 1 in 4 people, 1 in 4 women that you're looking around at, someone has experienced sexual assault or domestic violence and or both. And that person could be you, but it could be your sister, your mother, your friend, your neighbor, your coworker, one of the kids that goes to school in your neighborhood. And that means we cannot allow an individual to feel like they did something to deserve this. That's right. Or that they are bad. That does not solve the problem. That's right. For me, that gets to my third point. And And I haven't been kind of putting points on these. So you're probably like, what are you talking about a third point? But if we said the first point is to stop victim blaming, and that the second point is to believe victims when they come forward, then I would say the third point, and this one is really a game changer. And we keep trying to have this conversation, but we haven't successfully gotten there yet because we still have the same outcomes. And that is men must educate other men and boys not to sexually assault or perpetrate other violence on or against women or men, right? Mm-hmm. And that means we have to stop saying that women are the ones who control whether or not they're assaulted, whether or not they're beaten, whether or not they're abused, oppressed, manipulated. And instead, we have to start talking to people about how not to engage in those behaviors as individuals. Right. And that means we've got to take a very strong public position that men educate themselves and other young men and their peers to not commit these sorts of acts. We know, I think that the U.S. Department of Justice says that 99% of reports that are filed are reports where men have engaged in these actions against women and or other men. Now, I want you to think about that. If 99% of our perpetrators are men, why do we consistently try to police what women wear, what women say, what women do?
That's right. That's right. Well, and it's interesting because we get to a certain point where accountability becomes very, very difficult. There's this quote that I wanted to share. In order to escape accountability for a perpetrator, the perpetrator does everything in his power to promote forgetting. If secrecy fails, the perpetrator attacks the victim. If he cannot silence her, absolutely, he tries to make sure nobody listens. Okay, this is Judith Lewis Harriman. So this is the challenge for me, is that, and when we talk about narcissistic abuse, which also usually includes, often includes domestic violence, sexual assault, rape, all kinds of things. If that individual will not take accountability, we need to start changing the conversation so that our culture is one that takes a stand.
That's right. Absolutely. And I love that you bring up accountability. I'm sitting in my office at Weber State University, and I'm going to pull it off my cabinet. I have a little sticky, which it's bleached by the sun, so you can't see it so well. But what it says is, accountability feels like an attack when you're not ready to acknowledge how your behaviors harm others.
Oh, thank you. Oh, thank you.
Right. And I wrote that down probably a decade, maybe even longer than that ago on that card, because as I do work around race, ethnicity, gender, diversity, equity, all of those sorts of things, a lot of times people feel that they're being attacked, right? When we talk about equity. Well, I didn't own slaves, or I didn't do this, or, I'm fine if women are in the working world. But when you start pointing out actions or behaviors that people engage in that really don't reflect that, then there is this sense of, hey, pushing back. Those aren't my responsibilities. I didn't do those things. I don't have to deal with those outcomes. The reality is, if we're all living in the world today, we are all dealing with those outcomes. And what that means for us in terms of our ability to be engaged actors in our communities, to have access to resources and education and opportunities and all of those pieces. So when it feels like an attack, it's usually because we're not ready to acknowledge that we've supported something in the system that oppresses others.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah.
And, accountability is powerful, because when people own their actions, but then choose to be part of the solution, we are creating significant change. The documentary Tough Guys, I really love, because it really talks about how we can teach men and boys to treat culture differently, to treat women differently, and to engage in other behaviors that go against the grain, go against the norm.
Absolutely. And I believe it was Tim Wise who made that documentary. Is that correct? And we had him here as a speaker about 2 years ago for our diversity conference, and he was amazing. And one of the things that, he really tries to drive home is that our institutions aren't just harmful to women and girls, they're also harmful to men and boys because they reify this behavior of hypermasculinity that can be violent, abusive, all of those things. So we have to remember many times men are a product of the systems that we operate in as well, which is why it's so important for us to look at the structures and the systems of the institutions that make the laws, that make determinations about what punishment looks like and who gets punishment and what rehabilitation and treatment looks like. Because if, as a society, we do not believe people can be rehabilitated, there's a lot of work to be done. If we as a society believe that rehabilitation works, there is still a lot of work to be done. And that work is on everything from creating the resources and intervention tools for somebody to go through that process, as well as to reintegrate back into the community that they've harmed.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And then, someone who has harmed individuals in the community that rectifies those actions, then it creates a space where others feel more like they can come forward and address some of the secrecy, some of the other things. And so there's healing on both sides. But then when we bring it back to individuals who have been harmed, there's something that I will never forget. And that is when I went to Africa. I was part of this women's group. The women were just powerful and they just strengthened each other. Something happened in the community. They all band together and they resolved it as a community. And the community really worked together in a way that I was really just so appreciative of, and so different than I would say what the norm is, in my experience here. But it was incredible because when you saw people come together in strength, there was a lot of healing that happened, whether it was like, kids being sick or other issues, poverty, a fence goes down, all of these different issues. Collectively, the women were like, yeah, we're going to work together and do this. And it was absolutely amazing to me to see that.
So Sarah, I love that you point that you had that experience in Africa. Which country were you in, by the way?
Kenya, Samburu, very small. It was like in the bush, like camping for a month. It was the best though. That was like the biggest life-changing experience. I came back with such an appreciation, but almost like a longing for that, like how much I wanted to feel more and more of that. Because it was, even as much as we worked to create that, it just was a totally different dynamic. But yeah.
And having been in Kenya, what you're experiencing is a significant part of the culture. Mm-hmm. And the culture is one that has a strong communal basis, which means when something happens to one of us, it happens to all of us. And so we're all responsible for figuring out how to deal with the issue or the problem. And in the United States, that's less of what we see in general as a practice. We're pretty individualistic. And so we don't want bad things to happen to other people, but we're really good about trying to protect ourselves from bad things. And if something happens, we might be moved, we might donate money, we might be involved, but until something directly happens to us, we are less inclined to see that problem as our problem, as a community problem. And so while we want it to be resolved, while we want people to be okay, we don't see the problem as something that directly impacts us. And that is something that you'll find in a lot of, if you're in the United States, people might consider ethnic communities. So you're going to see these sorts of responses in South America, across the continent of Africa, and in areas where there are minoritized populations, because there is a history of reliance on depending on each other.
Yep.
So, yeah.
Yeah. And I appreciate that people are strengthened by that. Sometimes there's this fear that means that someone's like not self-sufficient if they're depending on people around them. But what we find actually in social work, because we're just really big into the individual, how we're affected by the culture, families, culture, and then how that extends out. But, it's interesting because when people have support around them, we're able to do more with that.
Yeah.
We're able to really move forward some of these things that we want to change because we're strengthened by one another. And it's just incredible. Yeah, it's incredible to watch. So Yeah.
Well,
I have a quote that I wanted to share, and it's, at any given moment, you have the power to say, this is not how the story is going to end. This is by Kristen Mason Miller. So I love this because wherever you've been, whatever you've experienced, I want our listeners to know that you can absolutely move from victim to survivor. It doesn't mean that what's happened is okay. And I want you to know that it's not okay. But that, especially with a positive support, people around you, resources like UCASA, Safe Harbor, the YCC, therapists, like by accessing these resources and giving voice to what happened, that you can choose a different outcome.
Well, right. You get to define the ending.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What happened to you may be a sliver of your story, but it's not your whole story. It's not going to define you unless you decide that that's what's going to define you.
Yep.
And we, as members of a community, need to be recognizing that we need to make sure that people are fully seen, not just as victims or survivors, but as a part of our common human experience. You know, we run the gamut of experiences. And what does this mean? And how do we come back from that? How can someone come back from that? Which again goes back to accessing resources and services and supports, which is also why it's so important that we be very aggressive at supporting things like the Violence Against Women Act and getting funding for that, so that there are resources for our communities. Because these are things that happen everywhere, but the resources aren't everywhere. So we know our rural communities suffer more because they have less resources, less places to go to report. People are less likely to be trauma informed in the police departments or in counseling services or in the schools. And all of those things add up. So when you're in a more metropolitan area or an area where there may be more resources, you might be more able to easily find those supports. But when we go out into the corners of the state and into the desert and some of the mountains, we don't find those things. Mm-hmm. And additionally, we have to be thinking about the cultural implications that are involved when these situations occur, and making sure that people are culturally competent, in addition to trauma informed, to work people to address these issues.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to speak a little bit to some of the cultural issues that maybe we're seeing in relationship to sexual assault. In high numbers, I've seen a lot of women coming to me who are in a relationship, be it marriage or something else. And the very common thing that I hear is that, is it rape because I'm married or because I'm in a relationship? It seems that it's very common for there to be, it's almost like it's permission and I don't have a voice and I can't set boundaries with what I feel comfortable with if I'm in a relationship. And we know that sexual assault happens much more frequently when we're in a relationship with a partner. I wonder if you could speak to that.
So this is 100% me. Mm-hmm. There is no rapeable offense. There is nothing you can wear or not wear that should allow somebody to believe that they can use your body without your consent. So I don't care if you are married and have a ring on your finger, or you're married and you don't have a ring on your finger, or you have a partner that's sometimes on and off. It doesn't matter. Mm-hmm. You get to have body autonomy. If you do not want to have sexual relations with someone that you happen to be married to or have some sort of legal relationship with, then you don't have to. And if somebody makes other decisions, that is violent, it is an assault, and it is something that you can seek support resources for. You can file a report with the police. And really, we need to see and hear and listen to people who have that experience, because women are not property.
Thank you. Thank you. So for our listeners, I want you to know that sexual assault is not your fault. Sexual violence is not your fault. domestic violence is not your fault. You did nothing to cause it, and it's not your job to cure it, but somebody else is doing to you. And ultimately, you can't control another person's actions. However, I want you to know there are so many resources and so many trained professionals that can help you through your story. We know that we now have tools like EMDR, which is rapid eye movement, that also helps with changing negative beliefs. Sometimes there's a reason why someone continues in a traumatic relationship. Sometimes it has to do with the way we think about ourselves and think about what we deserve and are worthy of. EMDR is scientifically proven to helping people with post-traumatic stress disorder. In 1970, we started using it with war vets. And now we found that we can use it with angst for anxiety, depression, PTSD, which often comes after a sexual assault. Victims suffer from PTSD, but I want everyone to know there's hope and healing. Yoga therapy, working with the body, is very powerful in releasing trauma. As we know, we store trauma within our body, and there are ways and tools to help you with healing and recovering. Again, it never makes it okay. The other thing that a lot of survivors have told me that they've really found a lot of empowerment in is, and Adrienne, I wanted to talk with you about this for a moment, is poetry that addresses it for what it is. Writing. You know, you may start off with just journaling and writing the experiences you've had, the pain, whatever it is that you want to talk about. And I've had people say, oh, I don't think I'm ever going to share this, but then people actually later on end up sharing it. And then it's a very powerful tool for other people, for other individuals. So
I see that as a liberating practice. Yeah. Additionally, if we've got content in our head and we're not able to let it out or express it in some way, then that's going to take up more and more of our space and our bandwidth and energy. And so by writing it out, writing it down, you can go back to it unless you want to burn it, which you can write it and burn it. And that's also liberating in its own set of ways. But one of the things is if you are able to put that onto paper or type that onto your computer and save it, it means that you don't have to hold on to that anymore. Mm-hmm. And for so many of us, we just hold on to things that we wish we could let go of, but we're not sure how we can let go. And I love that you shared that many times people will journal about their experiences or write about their experience and think, I'll never share this with anyone. And then they'll find an opportunity that comes down the path. Mm-hmm. And they'll say, no, I actually need to share this. This person needs to know that they're not alone. Mm-hmm. Yeah. That maybe this is where I was, but look at where I am today. And so there's so much power in that. And additionally, I'm just a believer in writing for yourself anyway, but it will also help you sort of see yourself on this journey. And sometimes it's so hard to see movement and that we are healing, right? Because we're smack in the middle of it. And so it's hard to see ourselves. But when you have that document or that journal or those poems or whatever it is that you write, you can actually see an emotional movement happening. Mm-hmm. And there's just so much value to that. But also as a reminder that you did nothing to deserve what happened to you. Mm-hmm. And you have a voice. And one or more people may have tried to take that voice from you, may have put you in a circumstance where you couldn't speak. But this is a way to help you speak because you can. It helps to empower you to get that language out of your head. And some might even say off your body and onto a page.
Yep. Yeah, that's beautiful. When we can look at our progress, even journaling 5 or 10 minutes a night, mm-hmm. but even writing down the painful experiences, mm-hmm. and then you see your progress, you can actually see yourself sometimes going through that grief cycle. And then as you're moving to acceptance, like you said, there may be an opportunity to share your story with others whenever that feels safe to you.
Right.
It's important. Yeah. It's important to be able to speak your truth. be seen and heard by people who are safe. Not everyone's going to be safe, but identifying safe people is a great place to start.
Agreed. Wholeheartedly.
Yeah. So, Adrienne, I just want to thank you so much for your time today. Thank you so much for all the work that you do, for so many people.
Well, Sarah, thank you for the work that you do, and for your listeners for building a community to share this content and develop greater understanding and support. Because unfortunately, these acts of violence and desperation happen around us every day, all day long. And so in addition to being armed with information, it is helpful for us to be aware so that we notice when things aren't quite as they seem.
Yeah, so for somebody who is not as aware, but would like more information and being a safe place for someone, what would you recommend for someone who perhaps hasn't experienced sexual assault or sexual violence, but would like to be a safe person?
So I say get educated, and we have such amazing resources in our communities. If you're in Davis County, there is Safe Harbor, which provides emergency shelter and support for women and children in domestic violence situations, sexual assault situations. We have Your Community Connection, also called YCC, here in Weber County, to help us with those same sorts of things and to provide career development and support to get people employed and back into school as well. Leverage those resources as well as two statewide resources. One is called UCASA, the Utah Coalition Against Sexual Assault. And UCASA provides an amazing 40-hour training where you can learn about different types of assault and different resources to help support folks in your community who've been harmed and are surviving. And that's just a wonderful resource because you will never know until it happens that you have a chance to be an ally. And so that's really impactful. You can also look to the Utah Domestic Violence Advisory Council. They have a training as well to become aware for domestic violence or intimate partner violence, which it's another great series that you can take as a set of classes to learn about. And then you can, again, become an ally working with a local shelter, being on a roster with your local police department so that people know if there's a crisis or emergency that you're not only educated, but you're also willing to meet with someone in their crisis moment so that they don't have to go through it alone. Again, those resources operate in large part on federal grants, state grants, and donations. And so making sure that your leadership in your communities, from your city council to the governor, are all aware that these are resources that need to be funded in order to make sure that our society is functional and that people have access to what they need to survive. And so I would go to any of those places. I'm at Weber State. We have a women's center that does amazing sexual assault advisory support. We have Safe at Weber, which is a program that all of our faculty, staff, and students go through to become aware of sexual assault, dating violence, domestic violence situations, and how we can access resources for support, where we can report if something has happened, and how we can be an ally in our community. And you'll see that at all of the state institutions, and the tech colleges are developing those resources as we speak. And there are, different church bodies have these sorts of resource arms, but the most important things you can do is first listen and believe, and then make sure that we are educating men and boys not to commit sexual assault or domestic violence or intimate partner violence.
Absolutely. And just adding to that also, that our communities and are also aware that we cannot stand behind that. We cannot stand behind blaming victims any longer, that we need to give them a voice and we need to support them through their healing journey. And I also want our listeners to know that if you have suffered from domestic violence or sexual violence, that you are not alone. This is significantly underreported.
Yeah.
It's very likely that your neighbor, a friend, family member has experienced some form of sexual violence, and we are here for you. If you need anything, you can privately reach out to to Erica on my podcast. She can give you some resources. Heart and Soul Wellness we specialize in helping individuals heal from trauma. And there's a lot of other community resources as well.
And if I can just put one last point out there, we really focused our conversation on women and girls, but listeners, please know, men and boys are also sexually assaulted. They are also victims of domestic violence and interpersonal or intimate violence. And that means that we have to be paying attention for everyone and making sure the resources that we offer can truly be accessed by everyone.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
You bet.
Thank you, Adrienne. It was an honor to be with you today.
Oh, you're very kind to me. These issues are near and dear to my heart and to the work that I've done here in Utah and other places. And so I'm just grateful that the work continues under such great leadership.
Thank you for listening to the Heart and Soul Wellness podcast with your host, Sarah Carter. Make sure to like and subscribe, and if you have any thoughts about what we talked about today, leave a comment. Also, you can find us at heartandsoulwellness.org and on Facebook and Instagram. Join us again as we continue to help women heal, connect, and aspire to their true and authentic selves.